By 6 p.m., my brother Jordan would be standing in front of 4 investors explaining numbers that did not actually work, and he had no idea. And I had known for 11 days exactly how that meeting was going to end because I had built the numbers myself, specifically for him to find and copy. And I sat in my car outside the building where the pitch was happening, and I checked the time, 4:52. And I thought about the 11 days that had led to this exact afternoon, and I thought, this is going to be the longest meeting of his life, and I was right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. And genuinely, if you are new here, buckle in. Because today's story happens almost entirely within one single day. The day my brother pitched investors using a business model he stole from me 11 days earlier. And I want to walk you through it hour by hour because the timing is honestly the best part. My name is Camila Reyes, and I am 29 years old. And I run a meal kit subscription company that I built over 3 years, and my brother Jordan is 26 and has a long pattern of watching what I build, closely enough to copy it, faster and louder. And 3 weeks before this story takes place, I discovered, through a friend who works in the same investor circles, that Jordan had been pitching a meal kit concept to early-stage investors that was structurally identical to mine. Same delivery model, same supplier approach, same pricing tiers I had spent 2 years refining. I did not confront Jordan directly because I had tried that approach with smaller versions of this pattern before, going back to college, and it never produced anything except Jordan apologizing and adjusting his language slightly while continuing the underlying behavior. So 11 days before the investor pitch, I decided to do something different, which was let him find a flawed version of my actual numbers and copy that instead, here is exactly what I did, and the timeline matters. 11 days before the pitch. On a Tuesday, I mentioned casually to our mutual friend Priya, who I knew was close with Jordan and would likely repeat things to him, that I had recently realized my supplier cost structure could be restructured to dramatically improve margins, and I described, in specific and convincing detail, a revised supplier tier that looked extremely attractive on paper, but that I knew, from genuine experience running my own company, was based on volume discounts that simply do not exist at the scale Jordan would actually be operating at when he launched. 9 days before the pitch, Priya, exactly as I expected, mentioned the conversation to Jordan, framing it as, oh, Camilla found some interesting cost savings recently, and Jordan, who had a habit of treating any information about my business as research material, asked Priya for more details, and Priya, who genuinely did not know what she was passing along, gave him a rough outline based on what I had told her. 7 days before the pitch, Jordan called me directly, which surprised me slightly because he rarely calls just to talk, and he asked vague questions about meal kit margins that I answered honestly, but without volunteering anything extra, letting him draw his own conclusions from a conversation he believed was casual. 5 days before the pitch, I learned from Priya that Jordan had revised his entire investor deck to incorporate the supplier cost structure I had described, building his projected margins and growth timeline around numbers that worked perfectly on a spreadsheet and would completely fall apart against real supplier contracts at his actual order volume. Because the discount tiers I had described only existed at an order volume roughly 4 times larger than what Jordan would be capable of in his first 18 months of operation, meaning his entire financial model was built on numbers that were mathematically accurate only for a company significantly bigger than the one he was actually pitching. 3 days before the pitch, Jordan texted me, "Can we get coffee? I want to run something by you." And we met, and he showed me with visible excitement an early version of his investor deck, careful to frame it as his own independent research. And I looked through it and saw my exact flawed numbers built into his growth projections, and I asked him a few gentle, clarifying questions. How did you land on these supplier discount percentages specifically? And he said he had done some research and talked to people in the industry. And I did not push further because I wanted him to walk into that pitch exactly as confident as he currently was. The day of the pitch arrived and I did not attend, obviously, but I knew the schedule because Jordan had mentioned it casually weeks earlier before any of this began, a 4 o'clock meeting with 4 investors at a downtown office. And so at 4:52, I sat in my car outside that building, not to watch directly, but simply because I wanted to be nearby when he called afterward. And I want to be honest that I felt something complicated in that moment, not pure satisfaction. something closer to a held breath. Because despite everything, watching your brother walk into a room to be professionally embarrassed is not a purely enjoyable experience, even when you orchestrated it. The meeting ran until almost 6:15, longer than scheduled, which I correctly interpreted as a bad sign, and Jordan called me at 6:22, and his voice had a flatness I recognized from childhood. The specific tone he gets when something has gone wrong that he cannot blame on anyone else. And he said, "Cam, I think I need to talk to you about something." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "The investors today, one of them used to run supply chain for a major grocery chain. And the moment I presented my supplier discount projections, he stopped me and said those numbers don't exist at this scale. Where did you get them?" And I didn't have a good answer. And I said, "What did you say?" And Jordan said I said I'd done independent research. And he looked at me like I hadn't. And the meeting basically fell apart from there. I let him sit in that discomfort for a moment before I said anything. And then I said, "Jordan, where do you think you got those numbers?" And there was a long pause, and he said slowly, working through it as he spoke, "I think I got them from a conversation with Priya about something you'd mentioned." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Did you know I was going to use them?" And I said, "Jordan, I told Priya a flawed version of my own numbers 11 days before your pitch, knowing she would mention it to you. Because you have spent your entire life treating my work as research material instead of asking me directly, and I wanted you to find out, in a room full of investors, exactly what that habit actually costs." Jordan was quiet for a long time on the phone, and then he said, "You let me walk into that meeting knowing it would fall apart." And I said, "Yes," and he said, "That's incredibly harsh, Camilla." And I said, "Jordan, I have asked you directly, multiple times over multiple years, to stop building your ventures by quietly copying mine. And every time you apologized and did it again in a different form. I did not see another way to make the lesson land permanently." And he didn't have a response to that for a while. And then he said, "Okay." And his voice had something different in it. Not defensive anymore, just tired and honest. And he said, "I think I need to actually figure out my own thing." I did not help Jordan rebuild his pitch deck. And I want to be clear about that, because I think people might expect me to soften this ending. But I decided, the same way I decided 11 days earlier, that rescuing him from this consequence would simply teach him that consequences eventually get absorbed by someone else. And instead, I told him I would be glad to introduce him to a business mentor I trust, someone with zero connection to my company, who could help him build something genuinely his own from the ground up. And he took that introduction, and as of this recording, he is 3 months into building a completely different concept. One I genuinely know nothing about because he has not shown me a single detail, which I think is actually the healthiest outcome this entire situation could have produced. And at a family dinner last month, he asked me a real question about supplier negotiations, and then caught himself and said, "Wait, I'm not trying to copy you. I'm actually just curious." And I laughed. And I told him the real answer, because some lessons only need to be taught once if the room is right and the timing is honest. And I think Jordan finally understands that watching someone closely enough to copy them will always eventually run into the parts of the picture only they can see. And I am glad, genuinely glad, that the version of my brother sitting across from me now is one building something slower and smaller and entirely, finally, his own.